Somewhere beyond traditional thinking, beyond standard treatments, is a place that bridges where we've been to where we're driven to be. It's where innovation that saves and sustains lives meets the providers who make it happen. Where our ability to manage illness expands to reach patients with limited options. Where we address complications before they become life-threatening. Where we're not only treating diseases, but also discovering smarter ways to prevent them. This is our place, where we come together to write our greatest chapter. As a visionary company operating at the center of global healthcare. This is the intersection of our boldest possibilities. This is the new Baxter.
Good evening, everyone who has joined our second Ethics Mini Symposium hosted by Baxter. Thank you for joining us, and I'm sure that you will enjoy today's program with us. We find ourselves nearing the end of a second year in the middle of a pandemic that brings a lot of challenges on so many fronts. And we thought that it would be very relevant, yes, to have discussions around ethics because it's always relevant, it's always interesting, but to have an upbeat stance to the topic of ethics. The inspiration started when we got hold of a publication where they looked at live music in a health care setting and the impact that could have on patient outcome, but also on your healthcare workers. And this research, one of the researchers, part of this research group was Dr. Harriet Etheridge. And we got into a conversation and decided that it would be very relevant to see from an ethical stance how we could all look at innovative ways of embracing this pandemic that we are finding ourselves in this new era of a pandemic world, and to make it a more positive environment to work in while it's still very challenging. So Dr. Etheridge has quite an interesting and very well background and relevant background to this topic this evening. She is a medical bioethicist and a health communication specialist based at Wits Donald Gordon Medical Center in Johannesburg, and she's actively involved in various projects at the forefront of medical innovation. For instance, she was a key member of the team that performed the world's first living donor liver transplant from an HIV positive mother to her HIV negative child in 2017. Dr. Etheridge's main areas of interest are regulation and compliance, e-medicine and social media in medicine, promoting equity in healthcare access, and advancing patient care in tertiary medical settings where sophisticated and expensive medical technology presents a complex set of challenges. She is part of a co-chair at the Wits Human Resource Ethics Committee, and at a national level, she's also part of the Medical Research Council's Research Ethics Committee. Through her work on various ethics committees, she enjoys the opportunity to promote healthcare excellence in research and service provision, in the best interest of patients. She has over 10 years of experience in this role, and this facilitates good clinical practice and compliance. She has various publications behind her name, and she's a sought-after public speaker who has received numerous awards for her work that she has been conducted. Dr. Etheridge is a visiting lecturer at Steve Biko as well, at the School of Clinical Medicine and at Wits University. So we welcome Dr. Etheridge, and I'm very excited to hear the upbeat and positive take to the new era and pandemic world that we find ourselves. Thank you, Dr. Etheridge.
Good evening, Lisa. Good evening, everybody. Thank you all so much for being here this evening. Thank you to Baxter for the invitation to give this talk. Lisa's introduction has very clearly set out what we were aiming to do. 2020 was a bad year, and I think many of us got to 2021 and we thought maybe it would be a bit better. And it wasn't all good. And the purpose of this talk is, first of all, to do some quite extensive table setting in terms of how our ethics frameworks have changed over the last 2 years. And then to look to the future, to look at innovations for a new era in healthcare and humanity. And I'm particularly going to draw on the ethics of care, which is another ethical framework, but one that people aren't as familiar with, to make this argument. So let's start by looking at what I have called healthcare BC. And that means healthcare before COVID, when things were normal, in inverted commas. There's so much research about healthcare and healthcare systems that predates the pandemic. And already it wasn't looking that great. What we were seeing coming through, and I've picked out some pressing issues, there are several more, was first of all, this systemic health professional burnout was becoming a really, really big deal. And health professional burnout particularly leads to an element of depersonalization, which is a very well established consequence of health professional burnout, where health professionals become so desensitized that the connection with patients is lost. And I'm sure many of you on this symposium tonight are aware of this. It's a real problem. It has some really desperate outcomes sometimes, like, for instance, the high rates of health professional suicide that we're seeing. So this was already an issue before COVID. We also had issues of equality and access, something that we in South Africa, those practicing in the state sector especially, will see on a daily basis. Equality and access to healthcare has been a pressing issue. It is a worldwide issue because access to healthcare is related to resources, and resources are finite. There is no government that has infinite resources to offer everybody every kind of healthcare that they need. But nonetheless, we're seeing equality and access issues that many have argued, and again, there's substantial published work about this, that many have argued is unjust. We've also seen waiting lists and backlogs in some countries. Again, something we're really familiar with in South Africa. But waiting lists and backlogs were a major function of healthcare systems before COVID came our way. And then a lack of human resources and facilities. I think one that in South Africa we also feel very keenly is the brain drain, is our people moving overseas. And this creates a lack of human resources, a lack of facilities, and it all works together to create a perfect storm where things like health professional burnout can become further exacerbated. So this was healthcare BC. And then I think when we least needed it and we were maybe worst equipped to handle it, COVID-19 came along and it changed everything. It changed our lives from the work we do daily in the hospital or in our rooms to the wider world as we know it. And I've got some examples here that really spoke to me. There are many other changes that have taken place. The first one was when we're looking at this element of depersonalization that I mentioned previously. What a way to depersonalize somebody, to be separated from your patient, than by so much PPE that many were wearing, that the patient wouldn't have been able to really distinguish any features of the person treating them. You can see how that barrier can become quite dehumanizing really rather quickly. And then some innovations within this space, like for instance, this picture of health professionals from Southeast Asia who would don a layer of PPE and then stick a picture of themselves over that and then don a second layer so that the patient could see who was treating them, so that they could see their face. And this in an attempt to humanize an interaction that had become further challenged by physical barriers. And then, of course, I think this is one that we're all familiar with now, the huge deployment of telehealth technologies and digital technologies in a medical setting to an extent that we had never seen before, using things like Zoom to connect patients who are isolated with COVID with their loved ones outside, Zoom consultations, and using things like telehealth platforms to connect doctors with the families of patients who were very, very anxious. So this was how COVID, there are many other options, as I said, but this is how COVID changed our environment in which we practiced, changed the very visceral nature of the patient experience in hospital. Then we had changes to our lives in the broader context. I think many of these pictures speak 1,000 words. This picture of the doctor in his tent, which he'd put up in his garage, because he was treating COVID patients, and that was how he protected his family. Of course, the middle picture, the quite devastating effect that the pandemic had on our very, very vulnerable population of elderly people, being physically separated from their loved ones at a time when loneliness can become so acute in later life. Then probably another familiar one to all of us, the way that we had to start connecting via Zoom, how it just wasn't possible to see our friends and family anymore in person. And then finally, and I'm pleased to say that it seems to have been internationally nearly phased out now, the bottom picture is a family in hotel quarantine, which many countries put in place, and was due to become the subject, I believe, and having read a lot about it, of quite substantial human rights challenges. So that's how it changed our environment. Then, of course, COVID changed our world as we know it. And here are some landmark pictures during that first intense lockdown. Paris, which is normally swarming, totally empty. The city of Johannesburg, empty. And this bottom picture here, where it all started, Wuhan, empty. So COVID changed that broader context. And then COVID changed our digital world too. We've never before seen so much information available to so many people. It's ironic because the very thing that kept us connected, which is this amazing digital technology we have at our fingertips, also threw a spanner in the works in terms of the information that was available. We saw this huge proliferation of fake news being spread on social media. And for us as healthcare professionals, this has a real tangible impact on our practice environment. Because what this relates in for us is that patients are reading this, and patients aren't always equipped, and this goes for their families too, aren't always equipped to determine what is fake news and what is not. It's a real challenge, especially when we look at medical evidence, which I'll speak about in a second. But that means that patients may be bringing fake news to bear on the medical encounter. And that can make the medical encounter, when they come for care, that can make the medical encounter all the more challenging. So COVID changed every part of our lives. In practice, if we weren't in a very good position BC, COVID made our position much worse and arguably much more tenuous. We saw burnout become significantly exacerbated in healthcare professionals during COVID, and there are several studies which support this. The evidence glut, which speaks to the world of fake news, we also saw for the first time ever a huge amount of ostensibly good scientific medical evidence being made available to the public on a level that has never before been seen. A classic example of this is medRxiv, a website that many of you may be aware of, which is a pre-publication website for scientific studies or clinical trials that have not yet been through peer review. So already there are questions there. And if you go onto the medRxiv website, there's a big disclaimer. Well, it's not that big, but a disclaimer written in red, which emphasizes that these publications have not been through peer review, but also says a sort of plea to the mass media: please don't report on these studies. Yet they get into the mass media really, really easily. And patients read it. And patients believe this stuff. And patients bring it to the hospital when they come for care. They bring the findings. They bring demands about the kind of care they would like. And I think for many of us on this call tonight, there's an understanding that evaluating scientific evidence is becoming more and more tricky, especially as our science itself becomes more complex. You need a background in biostatistics sometimes to understand a clinical trial. So for us as clinicians, if we find it that difficult, it's not surprising that patients will find it difficult too. We've also got compassion fatigue and moral distress, which relate to burnout to a level that we've never really experienced before. Speaking to some of the intensivists where I work, the compassion fatigue from a situation where you've got patients who are admitted to an ICU with COVID and in their sort of gasping breaths are saying things like, I wish I'd been vaccinated, and how heartbreaking that is for the people who are treating them. We also have patients and family members who are empowered to an extent that we have never seen before, which is good in many ways because we want empowered patients. But the problem is that oftentimes patients and family members are empowered with fake news or evidence that hasn't met the benchmark for publication in a peer-reviewed journal. And then finally, we've got new concepts that came about with COVID that it's been difficult to get our heads around. Things like triage and isolation, concepts that we're aware of, but that many have never had to actually implement in a clinical setting. So often quite theoretical concepts, which have now been brought to bear on our healthcare systems in a way that we probably couldn't have imagined before. And all of this together has created an ethical vacuum where, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, no one really knew what they were doing. This has invited us to transition our ethical frameworks and ethical thinking, which I'm going to speak about in a minute. So this is really a journey. And it's asked us to explore unfamiliar and very uncomfortable ethical dilemmas. So what our ethics frameworks do for us in healthcare, and I think it's really important not to lose sight of this, is our ethical frameworks help us to make sense of the healthcare context at the time. They help us to decide, based on novel or complex circumstances, what is the right course of action. But the right course of action differs depending on the complex and context and circumstances and who the patients are and how wider society is affected. So if you'll indulge me, I want to get into this in a bit more detail because it really cements the argument that I'm trying to make. So just to briefly talk you through the evolution of our ethics frameworks, and I've split it into three relatively crude categories here. There's probably a lot more nuance to it that is being lost in this slide. we had what I have termed historical medicine till about the 1900s. This historical medicine was characterized mainly by what you'll hear nowadays as people often saying very paternalistic medicine. So the idea of the doctor being the knower and the issuer of instructions, and the patient being the rather passive receiver and follower of instructions, without bringing much more of their life to bear on the medical consultation, without having much of a say in what the proposed treatment plan, for instance, would do to their lives, what the ramifications would be. Then from the early 1900s, I've said to the present, till 2019, end of 2019, we had what I've referred to as modern medicine, which is our idea of autonomy as the overarching or fundamental ethical principle of healthcare. Not that the others are less important, but autonomy came to gain great prominence. And patient-centered care. The idea that a multidisciplinary team who were all involved in inputting into the patient-centered care would result in better patient outcomes, but crucially that patients needed to have a say, that patients should direct and consider their healthcare decisions in the much wider framework of their lives. For instance, their decisions should take in their religious beliefs or their political beliefs, their financial circumstances, their family circumstances, and all of that came to impact the medical encounter. And if I can draw your attention to the timelines here, we've got paternalistic historical medicine till the early 1900s. And then the present, from the 1900s to 2019, we've got 119 years. This is not a quick transition. Then all of a sudden, along comes COVID-19, and we have to start thinking about the ethics of our practice in a totally new way. And this is where the public health ethics framework comes in. And essentially, the public health ethics framework is one that prioritizes the welfare of a group over that of an individual. I'm going to get into it in a little bit more detail in my next slide. But if we haven't really gotten this far, I think especially in South Africa, we've been maybe relatively fortunate if you compare our early experience to that, like what was experienced in Italy. We've been relatively fortunate that we haven't had to make these brutal public health decisions at the expense of individuals. But we have, as our COVID waves have come and gone, sort of oscillated between this idea of a more patient-centered approach to having to maybe take on a more public health ethics approach to how we use our resources. So public health ethics is decision-making under extraordinary circumstances. A pandemic would be a perfect example. And in South Africa, it would have been probably more than a pandemic. It would have been what we would have seen, I would argue, if the government had declared a state of emergency, because then we would have been in a really, really dire place. And we would have had to make these very often very harsh decisions that prioritize the individual, that prioritize the collective over the individual. Public health ethics is also an established framework for concepts like triage, because triage says that we will maximize our resources to those who have the best chance of survival or where it will do the most good. So in some cases, that would mean that certain individuals were not prioritized into care. But on the ground, this can be extremely hard to accept and hard to implement. And I especially think that if we look at health professionals in chronic care settings, so geriatricians, for instance, or if we look at pediatric populations, people who are caring juvenile arthritis, for instance, might be an option, but chronic patients where the health professional and the patient start establishing a relationship of trust and a rapport, and often this happens over many, many years, and then to suddenly have to transition to this place where your patient, because maybe they're elderly, because they've got a bad frailty score, whatever it's going to be, might be denied healthcare is very hard to accept, because it seems like a betrayal of our duty of care and our trust that we have established in that relationship. And public health ethics challenges the application of our accepted modern bioethics principles, especially autonomy. So this is something that we've had to come to terms with. And maybe, as I said, fortunately in South Africa, this hasn't been as acute as it might have been otherwise. But now we have the benefit of hindsight. So you'll recall at the beginning of COVID, radical measures were taken because we didn't know what we were dealing with. We didn't really understand this totally novel virus. So extreme measures were perhaps at that point called for and justified. But with hindsight, what we've started to see is how some of these measures have had lasting impact on our societies. So, for instance, this headline here from the Detroit News, that the suicide rate of senior citizens in Mexico is the highest now than it has been in 30 years. And this is due to the isolation that people have experienced. University College London, a study on children and the impacts of school closures and physical and mental health for children and young people, which have found really devastating effects there. And then a Royal Adelaide Hospital newspaper headline where basically, because of surgeries being cancelled, theatres have been sitting idle. And that is not public health ethics, because public health ethics is about maximizing our resources. But it's very interesting what we learn with the benefit of hindsight, because another saying I'm sure many of you have heard, many of you are familiar with, is that as we've walked through this pandemic, we've said, when we return to normal, I'll come and see you. When we return to normal, I'll be able to go back to gym. We have this fixation on returning to normal. But what we've started to understand more recently, and another catchphrase we've started to hear more often, is this idea of learning to live with COVID. We are going to have to learn to live with COVID. COVID is here for the long haul. In fact, I was on a webinar by Professor Shabir Mahdi, who is the Dean of the Faculty of Health Sciences at WITS, a few nights ago. And he suggested that COVID may be with us for our lifetimes. So this is not a flash in the pan pandemic. And the benefit of hindsight is perhaps telling us that we were too extreme in the beginning, and that we need to look for a new way forward in order to move our lives forward with this virus that we're going to be walking our lives with. So there's an Indian author, Arundhati Roy, who I'm sure many of you have heard of, who wrote a phenomenal article recently for the Financial Times about COVID and our approach to it. And I think it sums up in a way that I can't really articulate what we need to be aware of and why we need to look for a new era in healthcare and humanity. And if you'll indulge me, I'm going to read it out in full. So she says, whatever it is, coronavirus has made the mighty kneel and brought the world to a halt like nothing else could. Our minds are still racing back and forth, longing for a return to normality, trying to stitch our future to our past and refusing to acknowledge the rupture. But the rupture exists. And in the midst of this terrible despair, it offers us a chance to rethink the doomsday machine we have built for ourselves. Nothing could be worse than a return to normality. Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. So for me, that sums it up. The question is, what do we gain by returning to Healthcare BC? Healthcare BC wasn't that great to begin with. Can we leverage some of the innovation that has come out of COVID, some of the lessons that we have learned, to work towards healthcare with a new human face. I believe that we can, and I think that the ethics of care, to get onto my last ethical theory for this talk, I know there have been quite a few, is a theory that can really guide us as we look towards new innovations for a better era of healthcare. The ethics of care is not a well-established or well-known ethical theory. It's based in feminism and it hasn't really gained as much traction, but it is starting to gain more traction as our established ethical theories, like, for instance, of the principlistic theory. So the ethics of care says that moral action centers on interpersonal relationships. Now, to take you back to my slide right at the beginning with the PPE, to the extent that a patient wouldn't be able to recognize the face of their treating professional, that doesn't sit well with the ethics of care. That's not an interpersonal relationship. It celebrates our interdependence as human beings, the fact that we need each other. It's not about universal rights or maxims, which fits in well to this post-pandemic or living with the pandemic era. And it's also not about autonomy. It's about the way that interactions can be caring. And what I particularly like about the ethics of care is it's one of the only ethical theories that has enough space for us humans to exist side by side with technology. Technology ethics, especially in the healthcare setting, is something I'm very interested in and an area I've done a lot of work in. And I know that many of us are so weary of the new technologies that are coming out. But I do believe that this is the future, and we need to learn not only to walk hand in hand with COVID, but to walk hand in hand and really leverage and make the most of these new technologies that are available. So within this ethics of care, for the last few slides of my talk tonight, I'm going to look at the new era in healthcare and humanity and explore some of the amazing innovations that people are coming up with that fit into this theory and might make our healthcare a bit better than healthcare BC, that might be better than a return to normal. So there are many of these. I have just focused on the ones that speak to me that I think are particularly interesting. I hope you also find them interesting, but there are so many, and it takes a simple Google search to find most of them. First of all, I think on a macro level, we need to look at caring for the carers. I've spoken about burnout and how healthcare BC was characterized by burnout, which became so much worse during COVID. We have to start looking at the people who are providing care and taking their mental and psychological health more seriously. Addressing burnout and moral distress, however, has proven to be very complicated. And much of the literature on this before COVID took hold of our world was that it's not really enough to say, go to a yoga class, it'll make you feel better. Go out for dinner with your friends. Go and do some exercise, go on holiday. That's not really enough, because the concept of burnout itself is so stigmatized. And as long as there is stigma attached, as health professionals, we're not going to be as willing to seek help as we might otherwise be. And burnout is recognized as really a serious phenomenon. It is something that often needs professional intervention. But again, as health professionals, where the crux is, I think, the sticking point is that burnout is often conflated with professional impairment. And there's an international obligation, it exists in South Africa too, under the Health Professions Council, that if a practitioner believes themselves to be impaired or believes a colleague to be impaired, there is an obligation to report that person to the Health Professions Council. The reason for that is because a practitioner who is genuinely impaired, who has, say, a substance abuse issue, for instance, may not be practicing in the best interest of patients or may harm their patients. So there's a good reason for it. But it's hard for us in our heads to separate this idea, The idea that if I go and try to seek help for burnout, is somebody going to say, well, I'm going to have to report you, and therefore I might lose my income. My patients might suffer. I might not be able to support my family. These are very real and pressing questions, which is why it's much more than advancing recommendations for the here and now, whilst they can be very helpful. It's about working towards a less stigmatized burnout, about facilitating pathways for healthcare professionals to seek help that are non-threatening, that have a reassuring aspect that we are going to help you and it's going to be fair and proportionate. And then identifying and mitigating the root causes of burnout and moral distress is also very important. So there's one that I've come up time and time again against in my research. One cause of burnout for health professionals that I think we're not nearly aware of enough. And if we're going to care for the carers and care for ourselves, this is something that we need to look at super closely. And for me, that is health professionals' use of social media. So for those of you who aren't aware, if you've got a social media profile, say you've got an Instagram or a Twitter or a Facebook or now Meta profile, and you've divulged information about yourself, you've said, I'm an oncologist, or I work at this particular hospital, or I'm a pediatrician, or whatever you are, those apps take that information about you and they put you into an algorithm that will show you content that you think that they think might be interesting to you based on what you've divulged about yourself. Now, that's great, and many people find it very helpful, but the problem for us in healthcare is that when we're facing this level of burnout, it's a huge amount to take on. If you think about what is expected of a doctor during a lifetime, you're expected to deal with so much grief and so much loss and so much stress without breaking a sweat, much more than a normal person would be. And the idea that then you're going to pick up your phone and start scrolling Instagram and it might be exacerbated by an algorithm showing you these pictures, that's going to add to the distress and it's going to create an even worse sensation. So I would argue that social media channels really exacerbate burnout. And fortunately, there is one rather elegant solution. Now, I'm not saying this is a be-all and end-all solution, but you may be familiar with this sensation of picking up your phone and starting to send a WhatsApp. And then you've sent the WhatsApp and maybe it was really important, but then you start scrolling. And there's this wonderful website called The Phone Breakup, which I tell everybody about because it's free. You can download a free lock screen and you can customize it, or this one in the picture here is just the one that they've got, which is almost like a prompt. It's like a little trigger that gets you to ask yourself, before I unlock my phone, what am I doing it for? Why am I doing it now? And what else could I be doing? And it's things like this that will help us limit our screen time. And I really believe that as a profession that is facing pandemic levels of burnout, this is something we need to be looking after more carefully. And within an ethics of care, looking after ourselves and focusing on those interpersonal relationships with each other that will hopefully serve to stem some of this tide. Then I want to look at, in terms of patients, first of all, on a more macro level, what COVID-19 has taught us about hospital design. These two wonderful hospital designs here, I'm going to talk you through them now. I'm talking about innovation and our new era of healthcare. These are shortlisted finalists for the Wolfson Economic Prize for 2021, which this year asked people to design the hospital of the future. Design the hospital that brings a more human face to healthcare after this terrible pandemic. And what is so interesting about these designs, these were the two main hospital designs that were shortlisted, is this idea, first of all, of bringing the inside out and the outside in. So for those of you who are addicted to home shows like I am, that's a very appealing concept. But if you think about it in the context of COVID was about doing things outside. Let's go outside because we'll be safer outside. So this is saying, imagine a hospital where there's loads of outside space, where it will be safer for patients to see their loved ones, where we can facilitate interaction, where we can facilitate the ethics of care, that interconnectedness between people in this really calming and healing environment, where we don't have to say, I'm sorry, you can't see your loved one because we can't walk you out through the ward because of this terrible pandemic. So what I particularly liked, I'll just briefly talk you through these. This picture is a cross-section of a hospital of the future designed by a group of architects. And you can see the idea of creating multiple levels of healing spaces. What particularly spoke to me here was this idea of having a market on the ground floor, I guess, where you could buy food or drink that is other than what you get at the hospital, an urban farm, and I know the quality, the resolution is rather bad. This was the best I could get it, but a staff bar. Now, that is an ethics of care. That's saying we're going to care for the carers. We're going to give you a space. Of course, it brings up many more ethical issues that I'm not going to go into regarding serving alcohol on a hospital premise, etc., etc. Remember, these are the hospitals of the future. This is the era of the new humanity in healthcare. But there was certainly a lot of innovation here. And this is the starfish-shaped hospital, much the same concept, that the star in the middle is where you have your sort of critical mass of hospital services. So you have your theaters, maybe your radiology, your admissions, your main wards, your ICU, maybe your support services, your catering and your laundry services. And then you have these hubs around in the complex where patients can access specialist services or support services or outpatient services, whatever it might be. But fundamental here is that we're maximizing the surface level of a hospital that is exposed to the outside, and looking at that argument for creating a space for human interaction after a pandemic where we have been so separated from each other. That can't be a bad thing. And then finally, I want to look at innovations in the ward, implementing the ethics of care in a ward setting. And these are especially places where we can see how we can live and coexist with the new technology that is available to us and how it might actually make our practice better. So this is a picture of the telehealth ICU. And the idea of a telehealth ICU, remember, this is the future. So the idea is that patients who are in ICU, who are connected to a number of different monitors, all of those monitors will be connected to a central screen hub. And that doesn't even need to be in each hospital. That could be one hub that serves a number of hospitals. And when something goes wrong, when something unusual happens on one of these monitors, it will be flagged to a small number of staff who are supporting this hub, and it will then be acted on. Now, why this is important and why it facilitates an ethics of care is because if you delve into academic literature about the experience of a patient being in ICU, it's like the nurse came and she looked at the monitors and she made a note in the chart. The doctor came, she looked at the monitors, the team came, they had a discussion, they made a note in the chart. And patients say, but nobody even spoke to me. And what something like a telehealth ICU does is it frees up the human staff to undertake human interpersonal interaction, because these algorithms, in a good way this time, are doing the hard graft of the monitoring and the record keeping for us. So as I said, I know that people find this quite frightening because the idea of processing this much data to this capacity is something we struggle to get our heads around. But these are the innovations of the future. And I firmly believe that this is one where we could see healthcare with a more human face because of the interaction, the physical caring interaction that we'll create. This was also from the Wolfson Design competition, the Wolfson Economics Prize for 2021. the idea of how we minimize the overcrowding in our hospitals and how we need more fluid hospital spaces to accommodate things like COVID patients who need isolation. And these are pictures from a design of a COVID ICU, or sorry, not an ICU, an A&E or a casualty, where they were proposing that patients who had less severe illness could be accommodated in effectively like a first-class airplane pod. And that could be built into hospital as a space-saving mechanism, but also a mechanism that could quickly transition from being an isolation unit to a non-isolation unit, if the need was there, without the necessity of moving around a lot of furniture or moving beds or moving monitors or transferring patients. And there's certainly, the airline industry has been extremely innovative in designing for small constrained spaces. And this is an area where we also have a lot to learn. And then finally, in the ICU space, another fascinating concept that is coming up is the idea of the silent ICU. Now, remember that these are the innovations, the humane healthcare of the future. And it seems odd to talk about a technology as humane, but let's look at how this would help. So looking at research that has been done in patients hospitalized, especially in ICU, and some of this was done by an NHS colleague of mine, Victoria Hume, who I'm going to speak about in my next slide as well. She did a study in ICU, and the findings were fascinating, and patients were saying, the lights are on all the time in ICU, and I've lost track of whether it's day or night. And the beeping, there are machines beeping all the time. It is impossible to find a moment of silence in an ICU. And all of that came together for patients to create the opposite of a caring and calming and healing environment. It became an environment of great stress and distress. And for those of you who are familiar with ICU care, it became a place where delirium sort of ruled the roost. So this is a Dutch innovation here, the Companion, which I'm going to tell you about. Again, this is a design of the future of humane healthcare. And the idea here is that a patient would be in an ICU and would have a watch, almost like a Fitbit, which would have connections, Bluetooth or Wi-Fi, or maybe something more stable, to any instrument or machine that was monitoring them or providing an intervention. And if something went wrong, if that drip stand ran dry, or if something happened with the SATS monitor, the alarm would go to the health professional caring for the patient. The alarm would not sound on a machine by the patient's bed. It would sound in the vicinity of the person who could actually do something about it. And that would surely create a more humane, relaxing, calming, and healing health environment for our future. And then my final slide for tonight is actually a video, and I'm just going to talk you through it before I invite the technician team to play it. Again, conducted by my colleague Victoria Hume in the NHS, and I was very fortunate to be part of this one. And it was at the hospital where I work, Fitzgerald Gordon Medical Centre, and we undertook a partnership with the Wits School of Community Music, the Community Music Department. And they brought young student musicians into the hospital to play music for the patients and for the staff. Now, as a person who works in the hospital, the experience of this at the beginning was very odd for me and for a lot of my colleagues. We found it quite hard to get our heads around this idea that we had this very medical, sterile, clean environment. And here were these students who brought energy, who brought a vibrancy to the hospital that it took us a long time to come to terms with. But you'll see from this video, which includes a lot of patient feedback, what an impact this had in restoring humanity to the healthcare setting. And may I please ask that the video is played?
It's got mountains, it's got rivers, it's got sights to give you shivers, but it sure would be prettier with you. Where you want to do. You come back, listen, listen, that. Give me all you got and don't hold back.
Bulletproof, nothing to lose. Far away, ricochet, take your aim. Far away, shoot me down, but I won't fall. I am the
Remains is for me to say that yes, everybody in that video did consent to their images being used, and to thank you all so much for traveling this journey with me tonight, and to say that anybody who has ethics questions is most welcome to contact me. You can see my address on the slide. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dr. Etheridge, for this very, very enjoyable talk. For me personally, I was sitting there and thinking, for us in the pharmaceutical industry, how can we support you as healthcare professionals in, creating this new world that we actually want to enter in? Because I do think that even the industry has a very strong role to play. If you think of, caring for the carers, I like that phrase, what can we do to support an initiative like that? And just the way we approach our businesses. If you think of the social media concept that you shared, and how that really is not good for doctors, etc., to be bombarded by this virtual world. And yet again, if you think from the industry side, to not have that face-to-face contact, how we potentially actually contributed to that, and how we, also need to see how we can work together with you as healthcare professionals in supporting, this very challenging time. So my mind was, rambling on how we can find ways to really support you guys in the way that we work together. Like we say in Baxter, to save and sustain lives at the end of the day. And that one quote that you shared, where specifically nothing would be worse than returning to normal. That was quite impactful, because yes, we use these phrases like, when things are normal, I will, or get used to the new normal. But having said that, we might never have that again. And we need to actually have a positive mindset around COVID, which is difficult. I know it's being very optimistic, but to embrace it and to see how we can change our world for the better, due to being forced in a pandemic. So I've enjoyed it so much. There's so many things that I think I can personally comment on. But in a summary, those were the things that stood out for me. Another thing, maybe from a question perspective and coming from my side, is maybe just your further opinion on, this whole public health ethics and maximizing your resources. And yet that was the one thing that COVID took away from us. If you think of surgeries, of theatre time, and that's actually one thing that I think would take a lot of creativity as to how you actually get over that hurdle, because I think that's one of the strongest hurdles in a pure health environment, that has almost paralyzed a lot of healthcare professionals in actually doing what they have been trained to do. Because if there's no theatre, there's no patient, and they can't, practice their expertise. So I don't know if you have any thoughts, or, just off the cuff, on how do you actually, get over such a big burden and hurdle, and impact of a pandemic. But that was one thing, the to the ethical right of maximizing resources in public sector. And yet that's the one thing that we have been paralyzed with, I think, the most.
Yeah,
Very
so I'll just address it briefly. I think it's really important that the public health ethics framework isn't necessarily an easy fit. It's hard to get our head around, and it really only comes into play in dire situations. But it's a way of understanding what we're doing and the healthcare we're providing. So this is when I was saying that with hindsight, we have this 2020 insight into perhaps how we might have overreacted at the beginning, how some of these extreme measures, which have resulted, as you say, for instance, in delays in surgery, have cost patients their lives.
Yeah.
This is not a trivial matter. It's really important. And we know that now, but at the time we didn't. So the public health ethics is a way for us to consider our resource use in really extreme situations. And we, luckily in South Africa, we didn't get to that state of emergency in COVID, but we arguably at some points got close, and some centers got very close to having to really maximize on that triage. So it's a way of understanding it. But like all ethical theories, they have it has good aspects to it, and then it has some real, I think, critical points where public health ethics doesn't serve us well. And I think you've brought one up. So no ethical theory is absolute. It's about interpretation, it's about application. But what it gives us is a way of making sense of the world, especially the healthcare we provide.
Exactly. I see that there isn't actually any, questions coming through from the audience, which is also fair. I mean, we're heading into our new the new session in the respective booths. So I really just want to thank you once again. It was lovely, taking this journey on with you. And I think we should actually collaborate further in putting minds together on how we really do make an impact on the new era of healthcare. And thank you for your passion and dedication, towards ethics and the medical environment. So thank you so much. And then towards the audience, I just also want to indicate that, yes, it is Ethics CPD accredited event, of course. So our respective representatives would reach out to you per email, providing you with your certificate in the next couple of weeks. So you could be on the lookout for that to receive that. And please enjoy the evening further with us in the respective booths, where we would have topics around ethics and anesthesia, nutrition, and advanced surgery. Thank you, everyone, and have a good evening. Bye-bye.